Welcome to Civic Voters Education 2023 on Trust TV. Democracy is a process and involves participation of many stakeholders, political parties, citizens, judiciary, electoral body, among others. Just as election is vital to the emergence of a democratic leader, post-election activities should not be ignored because each of the processes counts to make a whole. There is the need, therefore, to carry all the segments of the society along in the electoral process. Voter and civic education are necessary to ensure that all constituents, men and women alike, understand their rights, their political system, and once again, understand the nitty-gritty and the A to Z in the electoral process. You are most welcome as we look at dealing with harmful content, with focus on hate speech and fake news in this episode. This program is facilitated by the Institute for Media and Society and funded by the European Union. The content of this broadcast do not reflect the views of Institute for Media and Society nor that of the European Union. To begin the program, let's take a look at some news highlights.
Assets comprising office equipment have been transferred to Nigeria Association of Women Journalists, NAWOJ, Yola, Adamawa State. Presenting the office equipment to the president of NAWOJ, Mrs. Ladibala, in Yola on Monday, IMS Executive Director Dr. Akin Akingbulu stated that the initiative was in line with the commitment of the European Union to empower women journalists across the country. Akingbulu expressed hope that the equipment would encourage female journalists to discharge their duties with ease. Receiving the equipment on behalf of NAWOJ, Mrs. Bala thanked the IMS for the donation, describing the gesture as historic. Among the equipment donated to NAWOJ are office tables and chairs, generator and air conditioner. Recall that IMS last week also donated office equipment to the Nigeria Association of Women Journalists, NAWOJ, Rivers State Chapter. The Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center, CISLAC, says election security needs to be improved upon in order to ensure that the process is free and fair. This was made known during an interactive forum with security agencies organized by CISLAC in Kaduna. The meeting was organized to engage security agencies and deliberate on crucial matters concerning election security, as well as a follow-up to previous engagements focused on the same critical subject. The Institute for Media and Society, IMS, has urged the media to improve its focus on the reportage and airing of programs that are aimed at engendering inclusiveness. Executive Director, IMS, Dr. Akin Akingbulu, made the call during a two-day workshop on sharing on good practices and trends on inclusive coverage for media practitioners held in Yola, Adamawa State. Akingbulu described as worrisome the performance of broadcast media in terms of carrying along marginalized groups in the society, especially during the last electoral process. He therefore urged participants at the workshop to work towards providing outcomes that would bridge the gap in inclusive coverage. Earlier, the program manager, IMS, Timothy Bamidele, said the EU SDGN Project 2 was to address the challenges media practitioners face during the coverage and reportage of inclusiveness during the electoral process and beyond. The conversation addressed issues such as the inadequate media focus on and visibility of women, youth and PWDs in the electoral process. Highlight of the conversation was the presentation and analysis of the broadcast monitoring exercise conducted by the Institute of Media and Society, covering 5 months, and development of work plans to address the challenges observed during the last elections, spotlight sessions on youth, gender inclusion in media coverage, and the use of sign language. The event, delivered in hybrid format, has 24 broadcast journalists comprising 12 participants at the venue and 12 online. Participants include producers, presenters, reporters of inclusion program, women, youth and disability inclusion programs on TV and radio, and other relevant groups drawn from 10 states across the country. The Albino Foundation has inaugurated a program called Able to Serve for people with disabilities, aimed at showcasing the capacity and competence of PWDs to occupy positions of authority in the country. The founder of the Albino Foundation, TAF Africa, Jake Ekpele, who stated this in Abuja, noted that PWDs have all it takes to be elected and appointed into political offices. Ekpele said the program will leverage on media advocacy, mentorship and accountability to ensure that they were included in the governance of the nation.
Welcome back. To usher us into today's interview, let's first hear the thoughts of Nigerians on the impacts of hate speech and fake news on the 2023 election process.
I could say that in some aspect, the provisions for not giving a lot of policy guiding the internet or the cybercrime aspect by the federal government has caused previous and a lot of problem in the country, because you couldn't recoup a lot of issues dealing with these cyber cafe issues. Now, not like some countries that have CTU, cyber threatening units and all that, but the issue has been paramount because there's no provisions for it by the federal government to actually tackle some issues. There's no consequences based on it. We've seen the record over times, plus NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who have practically with time tried in as much as possible to give a government warning ahead of time that this is one of the major issues to put into consideration going into the elections. We've seen how fake news have come to hurt most of the places. We've seen it with some political parties, and we've seen how it has caused violence and threats to the democracy in some part of the aspect. But now, taking a look at a call to actually retrospect the issue, what I would advise the federal government to do in a way is to actually create a cyber unit 24 hours every day in a week to actually look into the system, both on social media, both on the website, both on the dark web. I think having this provision on ground can actually, in a way, limit the way people promote fake news within the country.
I think the issue of fake news and hate speech during election is something that, as a country, we have been, battling with for so long. Compared to the 2019 general election, I think it's one of the major issues that affected the 2023 general elections. Because if you look at it, aside physical violence, fake news, especially fake news, disinformation is one of the major issues. In fact, when you look at, from the reports that have been presented so far by organizations, you see that fake news is even #1 issue compared to even physical violence that affected the election. Prior to the election, that is before the elections, we have issues of people, saying things that are not actually the truth. Even have situations where leading candidates, that is politicians who are contesting for the election, they're rolling out fake news so that people can vote for them. So the issue really affected the 2023 general election. And on election day, you can also see the situations whereby fake results were being spread and shared on social media. So, and as you can see, sometimes this can have triple effects, whereby when a result is presented on social media, which is not what INEC actually announced, before you know, some people might believe that what was later announced by the Electoral Commission was not the real result, because they have seen something somewhere before, which is actually not the truth.
It's becoming a very serious global challenge, and in our country here, it's an abuse of medium of communication. And it has a very negative impact on the election, because there's a lot of name dropping, assault, abuse, unwarranted, to individuals who what they are worth. What I want to advise the government to do to ensure that this thing is minimized is for the incoming 10th National Assembly to take it up as a matter of urgency to legislate on this issue, that we carry a very severe sanctions so that people will not be trapping on other people's rights in the way of freedom of expression and freedom of speech. That's the way to go. There must be very serious consequences of violations of individual or corporate organizations' status by individuals, either in the name of religion, in the name of political affiliation, or in the name of cultural affiliation. People should be sanctioned for wrongdoings. That is how to keep the peace and the cohesion of the states and the citizens, so that they can be prospered in socio-economic development and everybody can contribute to the growth of the nation.
When you look at some states where the elections were held, like for instance in Lagos State, yes, some people made statements that would have led to crisis in the country, where you now segregate some particular set of people that have spent most of their life in a particular area. Most of them were born there, all right? And now you are now telling them that they are not part of society. And these people pay their bills to the state government, and based on constitution, they have a right to vote. And you are now telling them because they are from a particular part of the country, they shouldn't vote. That alone can cause chaos in the country.
Of course, you can't do without a speech or fake news. When an election of such magnitude is coming, every party wants to demarcate the other party so that you don't vote for them. But I think Nigeria are wiser now. They know the candidate they wanted, and they still know the candidate they want. So no matter the level of demarketing, irrespective of any hate speeches or fake news, we all know our candidates. But one thing is that if we know that we are all Nigerians, we don't need to go into any demarketing of any individual, as long as we are saying we are in the same Nigeria. So Nigeria encompasses all the citizens that are there. Take, for example, if you go to America or an American comes to Nigeria, you are not going to hear that American telling you is from Pennsylvania or from California. He will tell you he's an American first. So that's the kind of attitude I think we should develop.
We recognize that misinformation and disinformation could create problem for the dissemination of credible information during the electoral processes. And to this extent, we were part of some of the measures to mitigate the preponderance of fake news. In the course of our monitoring of media coverage of the elections, that is the monitoring of print and online media, we checked for elements of fake news in those reports, and in our periodic reports, we identified elements of news that could be considered as misinformation or disinformation. But I must say that from the media that we monitored, the print and online media, we didn't really have much problem with fake news, or perhaps more specifically misinformation and disinformation. But however, if you looked at the media generally, we had that problem. We also had a problem on the social media, and to that extent, we partnered with the Independent National Electoral Commission to have roundtables where we talked about the dangers of electoral misinformation, and where the Independent National Electoral Commission was proactive in identifying some problems of fake news in the way their activities were being reported. And the roundtable came up with different suggestions and measures to mitigate this. And of course, we did encourage INEC, arising from that roundtable, to be more proactive with information so that we will not have this problem. Finally, fact-checking was part of the trainings that we held for journalists, particularly female journalists, in the countdown to the elections. And we also did the same thing for online journalists, where essentially we put them through how to detect fake news and the tools they can use to fact check, so that they themselves do not end up spreading misinformation. So these were some of the steps we took, and I think it perhaps contributed to some degree in reducing the incidents, at least on the part of the media that we were dealing with. The incidents of hate speech, incitement, and even fake news that we observed during the elections largely came from the political class. It was the candidates in the course of their campaigns that were throwing mods at their opponents. It was the candidates that were describing their opponents in very, very unpalatable terms, in some cases, degrading terms, using degrading language to refer to their opponents. The problem we had with that was that some of these issues even came up at press conferences and even during live coverage, interviews and the rest of them. And when you have live coverage, it is difficult to really check what that person would say. So this was for us a major problem. And what we also did was to draw attention to that fact that when you talk about fake news in terms of disinformation and misinformation, people tend to look in the direction of the media. They don't look in the direction of the politicians who, as we saw in 2023 elections, shared fake videos, shared fake news just because they feel that all is fair in a war, and we do not really accept that. So my take on that really is that if we're looking towards taking measures to check fake news, hate speech and incitement, then we must reckon with the political class because they are the major perpetrators, the spokespersons of the candidates, the spokespersons of political parties were chiefly responsible for this. At our level, we, beyond what I said earlier on in terms of training and so on, one of the major things we also did was to update the Nigerian Media Code of Election Coverage. And that code, apart from providing professional standards for journalists on how they should cover the elections, also talked about what the political parties, among other stakeholders, should do to create the enabling environment for journalists to cover the elections. Apart from political parties, we had INEC, we had the law enforcement agencies. And essentially what we said was that they should guarantee access for journalists to cover their activities. But given the question that you just asked me, in terms of my take on the fact that we still had this speech and incitement and fake news, and given what I just said, that some of these are traceable to the politicians, my take going forward would also be that perhaps in future we might have to update the Nigerian Media Code of Election, Nigerian Media Code of Election coverage for that, to also say that part of the responsibility of political parties is for them to disseminate credible information and refrain from disinformation and misinformation. But it is also a demand, whether we update the code or not, that all of us should put on the political class. The government and law enforcement agencies must turn their attention in appropriate directions. When we say in time like this, what does this time represent? We are in the post-election period, and emerging from the elections are a number of conflicts. And some of these conflicts are playing themselves out in the arena of the courts, in the judiciary, where some are challenging the outcomes of the election. But beyond that is the fact that the elections have left people with divided opinion. Those who felt the elections were okay, those who are aggrieved, those who are very, very angry. And so we can say that post-elections, we are in a conflict situation in Nigeria. We are in a post-conflict situation because the elections have left some people happy, some people not happy, some aggrieved, some angered. And to that extent, we actually can speak of we're in a crisis situation or a conflict situation in the post-election Nigeria. And to that extent, we need to work as media towards the de-escalation of these conflicts. We need to take much more seriously our responsibility to manage these conflicts. It's not about not telling the truth or dealing with that. As a matter of fact, the code of election coverage admonishes us to stick to the facts of electoral matter or disputes. Don't bring in your own opinion. Don't bring in your biases. We know that all of us had our preferences among the candidates, but when you are reporting conflict, you have to report the different sides to the conflict and do not necessarily suppress the truth. Where there is outbreak of violence, we have to be careful how to report that. What we do not want is a situation where the media will be held responsible for any threat to the peace of the country or in fact to the corporate existence of Nigeria. And so let's take that obligation much seriously. So for those in the broadcast media who we need to remind of the existence of the Nigerian Nigerian Broadcasting Code, and the print media that we need to remind that we have the Code of Ethics of Journalists in Nigeria. When we are interviewing people or bringing them to some of our live programs, we need to commit them to a kind of memorandum that they will not use hate speech, they will not disparage their political opponents, just to be sure that we as media, play our role as responsibly as possible. I always say that in crisis situations, the media has a social responsibility, and that social responsibility is to ensure that in spite of that crisis, we are able to foster a productive society. My message for them would also be that they need to watch it, they need to desist from such acts, because they could set the country ablaze, they could set people against themselves, and we've seen the results of racially induced conflicts in other parts of the country. We can easily cite the example of Rwanda, where the propagation of hate speech, not just by the media, but by citizens against others, led to a crisis that was not manageable. We have to acknowledge the fact that one of the fallouts of this last election was the fact that attempts were made to profile certain ethnic groups or an ethnic group and refer to them palatable names. In fact, issue threats against them. We need to call on citizens that do all this, that they do not augur well. Election is about freedom of choice. It's about the right of people to choose their candidates, and we must be tolerant of the choices of others. We must be tolerant of their opinions. We may oppose ourselves, you may criticize, you might say that your candidate is not better than mine, and you might come out with the reasons, but we should not criminalize the right of people to make their choices in elections. So for all those out there who are using the instrumentality of fake news, of misinformation, disinformation, and even hate speech to attack people that they perceive as their political opponents, they should just stop, because our nation will not make progress if we continue with such attitudes. It's good that we have the judiciary, and we are optimistic that the judiciary will look into the issues dispassionately and come up with appropriate judgments. And there's nothing we can do about that, except for us, once again, to call out on our own constituency, the media profession, the profession of journalism, to understand the imperative of the accurate reporting of what is happening in the courts as far as election disputes are concerned. Because people can easily misinterpret the pronouncements or even the judgments of some of the judges. And this is where we need to remind our colleagues about the need for them to make use of experts, because it's not everybody. In fact, when some judgments are made and some pronouncements are made by the court, sometimes you have different interpretation by different lawyers. So we must not rush to report some of these things, but ensure that we've done our work painstakingly by speaking with experts, the lawyer, the legal authorities, to explain things that we do not understand, so that we do not in turn mislead the public. However, it is still unfortunate anyway that we're having some of these litigations. Some of them even deal with pre-election matters related to disputes within the political parties. We saw some of them playing out at the sitting of the election tribunal, the presidential election tribunal, where factions of the political party are clashing among themselves, which manifests part of the problem of lack of internal democracy in the political parties, and that has to be looked into. The other thing that I feel should be looked into is how we could evolve a system where election matters are argued, are taken to court, and dispensed with before the winners are sworn in. we don't have to continue to repeat a situation whereby somebody, for example, might have been a state governor for 2 to 3 years and then is declared non-validly elected or wrongly elected. And then another person has to come in. Meanwhile, taxpayers' money that have gone into payment of his salaries and other forms of allowances. I know that there is a strong argument that you cannot gag the judiciary. Some have said that, remember, the civil society were proposing that election matters should have a specific lifespan, the period within which they should be concluded. But the argument is that the judiciary cannot work like that. You cannot put the judiciary in chains because they may need to carry out a lot of investigation and listen to all parties. But be that as it may, I still feel that the electoral timetable can be managed in such a way that we're able to dispense with all election petitions so that those that have been sworn in will know that they've overcome all obstacles and they are now there to govern, and then we can begin to put our demands in there. It is not healthy for a democracy that cases last beyond elections and last beyond the swearing in of the winners.
Thanks for being part of this episode. Remember, all citizens have a role to play to build a great nation, especially a democratic one. Understanding of the electoral processes, peace, unity, justice, and law are key factors to maintain the peace and overall development. Join us in the next episode. This program is facilitated by Institute for Media and Society and funded by European Union. The content of this broadcast do not reflect the views of Institute for Media and Society, nor that of the European Union.